So it's my honor and pleasure to welcome and to introduce Director of the FBI, Jim Comey.
Thank you so much, President Decatur. I wish I could explain to my parents as well as you just explained it why they were paying for an education in chemistry. They thought it was about alchemy or something. Thank you all for being here. I very much appreciate your taking the time on a rainy weeknight. There's only one of you who is required to be here, and that is my son. The rest of you could have actually been enjoying a little free time before finals. And as the weather has finally improved. So I am very grateful that you've taken the time to stay and to listen to me. And then I hope to talk with me, because I want to share some thoughts, and I'd like to have a conversation with you that focuses on the things you'd like to know about, the things you'd like to test me on and push me on. That you're here means you care about these issues, which I do very much. And this is a great thing that Kenyon is sponsoring this conference. Tonight I want to talk to you about privacy as the keynote speaker. I also want to talk to you about how we might have better conversations about privacy, how we deal with the issues of privacy, how we think about the costs associated with the tough decisions will affect your lives, I'm talking to the students now, most of all, and longest. So I think we need to find a way to make smart, balanced decisions, ones that will serve us well over the long run. And to make good decisions, we have to find a way to have good conversations about things that matter and that can often separate people of goodwill. So let me start with something you heard earlier, expectations of privacy. So what does privacy mean to you? What are your expectations and what should they be? Right now, I suspect your privacy revolves mostly around social media and your personal lives. You don't want your mom to see the text you're exchanging with somebody in bio class. You don't want your next employer to know that you're a big fan of taking Fishgape selfies with your friends. I understand the Fishgape has replaced the duck face in selfie world. I am much cooler than I appear to be. You want to keep your nosy relatives from reading your Facebook posts, your tweets, visiting your Instagram account, looking at your texts. You really don't like the idea of the government, law enforcement in particular, seeing any of it. Not pictures, not texts, not tweets, who your friends are or where you've been online. I get that, I really do. I don't want anybody looking at my stuff either. I don't want anyone poking through my Instagram account, which has 7 followers. They're all my children, my spouse, and I've let one son-in-law in so far. But as much as I get that, I also think there are other perspectives in play, other issues to consider. Imagine this. What if law enforcement had a phone owned by somebody who abducted your sister? Or a phone used by a suicide bomber who blew up the train station in your hometown? Or the phone of somebody who hurt a little kid in your neighborhood? Would that cause you to think about it differently? I think it should, or at least it should change the way that we have a conversation about it. And I'll tell you why. In this great country, we often have a reasonable expectation of privacy in our houses, in our cars, in telephone booths, in our devices. That makes good sense. That has long meant that the government could not invade our privacy without good reason, reviewable in court. But it also meant that with good reason, law enforcement could enter private spaces. Since the founding of our country, if law enforcement had probable cause to believe that there was evidence of a crime in some space, whether that's a house or a vehicle or a device, some space that you controlled, law enforcement could go to a judge and get a warrant. Go to that private space and look through your stuff. They could search wherever the judge said they could. In your car, in your closets, in your computer, in your phone. They could take whatever the judge said they could take. There are vital constraints on law enforcement, and we must never, ever forget them. But the general principle is one we have always accepted in this country. There is no such thing as absolute privacy in America. There is no place outside the reach of judicial authority. That's a bargain that we made with ourselves 240 years ago to achieve 2 things we all treasure. liberty and security. And that bargain, no invasion of private spaces without good reason and appropriate oversight, has made America a country rooted deeply in the rule of law. But it has also meant that there are no absolutes in American life. All kinds of interactions that are incredibly important to everybody here and to me, incredibly personal and private, none of them are absolutely so under the law. Private conversations that matter most to us, often at the most difficult moments in our lives, conversations with our doctors, with our attorneys, with our therapists, with our lawyers, with our spouses, with reporters, with all kinds of people that we have to have important conversations with. Those are all protected by law, but none of them absolutely so. All of those zones of privacy can be pierced if a court finds compelling reasons to do so. And there have long been physical spaces in our lives that are intensely personal and private to all of us, but none of them absolutely so. Safe deposit boxes, storage units, car trunks, our diaries, even if we have one of those little locks on them. All of those things can be opened if the interests favoring opening them are compelling. As strange as it sounds, even our memories are not absolutely private. Any one of us could be compelled by a judge to testify about what we saw, what we heard, what we remember. And we can be compelled to say what's in the content of our minds, even if it would hurt us, even if it was incriminating to us, so long as we were protected from the government's use of that information by an immunity order. In America, we've always balanced privacy and security. It can be messy, it can be painful, but we've always worked through the three branches of government to achieve that balance in a sensible way. And the country's effort to achieve that balance for over 200 years was not complicated by technology, because there was no widely available space in American life that couldn't be entered if there was a court order. No car, no trunk, no closet, no safe deposit box, no safe that couldn't be opened if a judge said it should be opened. But here's what changed. The advent of widely available strong encryption has changed the entire thing. And it's really happened in a huge way just in the last 3 years. I say it that way because encryption has always been around, at least for decades, always available to the sophisticated user, both for data at rest sitting on a device and data in motion being transmitted over a line. But what's changed in the last few years is that it has now become the default, covering wide swaths of our lives and covering wide swaths of law enforcement's responsibilities. For mobile devices, for example, Apple and Google made the move to encrypted devices only in late 2014. Seems like a lifetime ago. WhatsApp announced that move on all of their services yesterday. 1 billion people now communicating in ways that can't be intercepted, even with a judge's order. Today, those of us in law enforcement are confronted with boxes that can't be opened. We face devices that we can't open. We face data that, even if we're able to collect it with a court order, we can't read it. It's gobbledygook to us. So encryption brings us to a place where, to quote a portion of the Fourth Amendment, all of our papers and effects can be entirely private. To a place where nobody can listen to our conversations, read our texts, look at our documents, see our pictures, know what's in our emails, unless we give them permission, unless we say so. And there is a lot to love about this. I love strong encryption. It protects us in so many ways from bad people. It helps the FBI with our mission, which centers on protecting privacy and fighting hackers. In many ways, I think all of us like the idea of a storage space in our lives that no one can get into, a safe box that's only mine. But it takes us to a place, absolute privacy, that we have not been to before, where the balance we have long struck is fundamentally challenged and changed. And that's why we have to talk about it. That's why we have to have an adult conversation about the balance that means so much to all of us. Because no matter how you feel about it, you have to acknowledge there are costs to this new world. You may decide the costs are outweighed by the benefits, or you may decide that there's nothing we can do about it technologically, but you simply have to, as part of the conversation, stare at the costs in a fair way. And the reason for that is we are not the only ones who love strong encryption. Child predators love it. Organized criminals love it. Terrorists love it, and it's part of their tradecraft. And hackers love it in all of their work. All of those people understand the power of strong encryption. ISIL, the so-called Islamic State, uses mobile messaging apps that are encrypted end-to-end to reach its followers, motivate them, and then direct them. We work very, very hard in the FBI to track those who might be moving to violence on ISIL's behalf, but sometimes it's like searching for a needle in a haystack. And when that needle moves to a mobile messaging app that's end-to-end encrypted, that needle disappears. And the great fear that dominates our lives is that that needle is going to reappear at a train station wearing a suicide vest. And as I said before, we can get a court order, but what we collect is unreadable. Last spring, to give one example, a group of terrorists tried to attack, and did attack, a Draw Muhammad contest in Garland, Texas. Before that attack, one of those people in Texas exchanged 100 messages with an overseas terrorist. We today have no idea what they said to each other because they used a mobile messaging app that was end-to-end encrypted. We can look at that, it's gobbledygook to us. And this isn't a problem just in national security cases. Last spring, an 8-month pregnant woman opened her front door in Baton Rouge, Louisiana to somebody she apparently knew, and that person killed her. The case is cold already. Her mom says she kept a detailed diary on her phone. The phone was there with her body, and the phone is locked, and we can't open it. So we don't know what was going on in her life that she confided to her diary, and that case remains unsolved. These are powerful and painful examples, but I think everybody has to agree that whether you work in technology or law enforcement, or you simply own a phone, which I think is all of us, the logic of strong encryption means that all of our lives, including law enforcement's life, will soon be affected by strong encryption. Because we live our lives on these mobile devices, and when those are off limits, despite court orders, our world changes. So my first point is simply, we have a problem. Maybe there is nothing that can be done about it. Maybe there is, but we should weigh things differently. But I hope we will start with the common ground that ubiquitous strong encryption is bringing significant change to the way we think about liberty and security. And we should try to have a thoughtful conversation about what do we do about it as a people. So let's turn to what I hope, what I dream that conversation can be like. I have discovered that it is incredibly difficult to have a good conversation about the impact of encryption on law enforcement and national security. There is, for reasons I don't fully understand, an intensity of emotion around the issue on all sides that makes even really bright people struggle to find balance and empathy that they might otherwise bring readily to hard topics. A group of technology companies last year sent a letter to President Obama where they urged him to promise never to seek legislation to address the intersection of encryption and public safety. And that's certainly an understandable position, and these were serious people from serious companies. But when I read the letter at the time, I said something that maybe one of those things that's in your head is, did I say that out loud? But I did say it out loud, and I meant it, and so I'm going to repeat it. I said, I think the letter is depressing. And the reason I said that is, the letter did a great job of talking about the awesome things that encryption offers all of us, and I agree with all that. But the letter made no mention of the impact on public safety. And to my mind, that meant either that these folks writing the letter didn't understand the potential costs, or that they weren't being fair-minded about it. And either way, that was a depressing thing. Because to me it said either we have to spend a ton more time trying to have people understand why we're talking about this, or a ton more time trying to get people to be open and fair with us in the conversation. And I got to tell you, I found a whole lot of the rhetoric that we have engaged in this country in connection with the recent litigation involving the government and Apple. I found a whole lot of it similarly disheartening. First, let me make sure that we're all on the same page when it comes to that case. In December, 2 terrorists attacked an office gathering in San Bernardino, and they killed 14 people and wounded 22 others. They left behind 3 phones. 2 were kind of cheapo phones that they smashed, and we could not recover anything from them. The third was an iPhone 5C running iOS 9, and that matters. It was a phone owned by one of the killer's employers, the county of San Bernardino. For the FBI to competently investigate a mass murder in the United States, we believed we had to use all lawful tools to find out whether there was evidence on that phone that either shed more light on what these 2 killers had done or shed light on who else might be involved and still out there. So we got a search warrant, and we got consent from the phone's owner, the county, and we tried to open the 5C. We checked with everybody inside the U.S. government, and we checked with a whole lot of people outside of the U.S. government to see, does anybody have a solution that will allow us, with a court order, to open a 5C running iOS 9? Because the danger is, if we try and guess the passcode, beyond the 10th guess, the phone may well auto-encrypt permanently, essentially erase itself. And even if that feature goes away, guessing would take us decades, because the phone is designed to have each guess require a longer period of time as you wait to make the next guess. And to make the number of guesses you'd have to crack a code, it would take us many, many years. So we went to court, the court from which we got the search warrant, and the government's lawyers from the Department of Justice requested a court order that would direct Apple to do a couple things, 2 things. Shut off that auto-encrypt feature on the phone, and shut off the feature that delays successively longer periods after each unsuccessful guess. And with those 2 features disabled, then the government would be able to try to guess the code. And our people were confident that they could guess it without those features with electronic pulses in about 26 minutes. So under the judge's order, Apple would be required to write code for that phone to turn off those features. The phone could stay in Apple's possession. The software that they wrote would stay in Apple's possession. Apple resisted the order, which is their right. And their main argument was that the court didn't have the authority to order them to take the step of creating software for that particular device, that it went beyond the court's authority to direct Americans to assist with the execution of court orders. And that's a good faith, reasonable argument about a federal court's authority, and it's an interesting question. Obviously, the government has a different view of the law there, because we believe that the court's authority does extend to such assistance, but it was Apple's right to make that argument. If I were their lawyer, I'd have made the same argument. I believe it was a reasonable argument, even if I have a different view of the law. But beyond the reasonable legal arguments, the controversy over the Apple case, over the challenge of encryption more broadly, has been chock full of slippery slope arguments and absolutist arguments. If we do this, for example, and you can supply your own this, but if we open this phone, if we make this accommodation, then horrible things will inevitably happen. It's the first step down a slippery slope. Or a whole lot of folks have said things like, we must protect privacy absolutely. Phones contain our lives, and they must be off limits to the government. I know you've already learned this from your philosophy classes here at Kenyon, but every time you hear somebody making a slippery slope argument, alarm should go off in your head. There is a reason your professors call this slippery slope fallacy. It could be that if you take one step, you inevitably fall down a slick slope. Could be. But it depends a whole lot on what kind of shoes you're wearing, whether the slope is a stairs slope, and whether there's a railing. It is a fallacy because it is deceptively misleading. Sometimes one step leads inevitably to others, sometimes not. It depends upon a whole lot that a good conversation is needed to figure out. And the notion that privacy should be absolute, or that the government should keep their hands off our phones, to me just makes no sense given our history and our values, something that President Obama said 2 weeks ago in Texas. You may still end up disagreeing with the government, but starting from the position that privacy should be absolute is just not a fair-minded place to be, in my estimation. What I find so frustrating about the emotion around encryption is that very, very smart people who would otherwise be deeply skeptical of slippery slope and absolute arguments in the context of other issues like guns seem less skeptical of those kind of rhetorical techniques in this context, for reasons that I honestly do not understand. It is simply not the case that if Apple wrote software for the killer's phone, it would inevitably be at catastrophic risk. Any more than we are all at catastrophic risk now that the government has purchased a tool that allows court-authorized access to the phone. As I mentioned, until late 2014, neither Apple nor Google made phones that law enforcement couldn't open. And with court orders, they routinely open those phones. Today, the iCloud is encrypted. Apple decrypts it in response to court orders and produces the contents in law enforcement investigations. In my view, privacy and security didn't end in 2014, and we are not ending it today. There are risks, there are benefits. There are steps that make us more secure, there are steps that make us less secure. It requires detailed facts and balancing to assess how do those risks, how do those benefits change with each step. I believe the stakes are high enough that thoughtful people should work very hard to resist fallacies and talk to each other in a fair-minded way. It's also not the case, I believe, that any infringement on privacy is to be feared. The question we must all ask is this: so what's the nature of the infringement, and under what circumstances, and with what oversight? And what are the benefits and the costs associated with that incremental infringement? We have to find thoughtful, productive ways to talk about issues of privacy and security. And here's the thing: by thoughtful, I don't mean that I'm right, you're wrong. I could be wrong about the way I assess, the way I perceive, the way I balance, the way I reason. But I think all productive conversations start from a place of humility. I could be wrong. I hope very much that you recognize that you could be too. And if we start there, that's the basis for a good conversation. On behalf of the grown-ups of the United States, I'd like to apologize that we have not done a good job in this country in recent years at modeling how to have good conversations about hard things. We tend to shout talking points at each other, or as we get cooler, even though we're old, we launch tweets at each other without any real interest in questioning our own assumptions, our own perceptions, our own reasoning, and without an openness to being wrong, in whole or in part. The litigation between the government and Apple over the San Bernardino phone has ended because the government has purchased from a private party a way to get into that phone, 5C, running iOS 9. I think that's a very good thing for at least two reasons. First, that litigation really was about the government needing to get access to a terrorist device. As I said at the time, we should be fired if we had a lawful means to get into a terrorist phone and we didn't try to. It was not, repeat, not about trying to send a message or create a precedent. We kept trying to find ways into that phone before we brought the litigation. We kept trying to find ways to get into that phone after the litigation. And one of the benefits, one of the maybe few benefits to all the controversy around it, is that a worldwide market of creative people was stimulated that hadn't existed before. Where a whole lot of folks tried to see, could I break into a 5C running iOS 9? And everybody and his Uncle Fred called us with ideas. We had people in Congress asking me about ideas during hearings, and I said, I welcome all comers. This really is about trying to get into that phone. We have a conversation we have to have about the broader issues. I don't want this to be part of it. I want to find out whether there's something we need to know in a terrorist phone. Someone outside the government, in response to that attention, came up with a solution. One that I am confident will be closely protected and used lawfully and appropriately. That's a very good thing for this terrorism investigation. Second, litigation is a terrible place to have any kind of discussion on a complicated policy issue, especially one that touches on our values, on the things we care about most, on technology, on trade-offs and balance. So it is a good thing that the litigation is over, but it would be a bad thing if the conversation ended, because we have to have it. It's unbelievably complicated, touching on every issue we care about. It has implications for safety, privacy, innovation, human rights, national security, international relations, probably a few others that you can think of that I can't think of. It does not fit in a tweet. We must have the conversation because encryption's impact is great, wonderful in a lot of ways, and growing. And so, at some point, it's going to figure in a major tragedy in this country. It is very hard for us as a people to have thoughtful conversations in an emergency and in the wake of a major tragedy. We have to have this conversation now. And let me show you what a dreamer I am. I hope as we have this conversation that we will successfully resist some of the most challenging aspects of our very nature. One of the strongest forces I think in human experience is the confirmation bias. That extraordinary aspect of our brains that makes us hungry for data that is consistent with that which we already believe, and often keeps contrary data from reaching my consciousness, from never entering into my mind because it got filed away before it got there. I don't know about you, that is terrifying to me. I think it's part of the reason that humans can convince themselves of nearly anything and then cling to it like a life raft in a storm. It's one of the things that should make all of us, in government and out of government, skeptical of power. John Adams once wrote to Thomas Jefferson, "Power always thinks it has a great soul." People in my experience are at their most dangerous when they are certain their cause is just and certain that their facts are right. And oh Lordy, they are frequently certain of both. Today, even if you're tempted to doubt, you can be quickly reinforced by an echo chamber that's on your device 24 hours a day. It will buttress that which you already believe. So there's very little risk of you overcoming the confirmation bias that way. And to depress you further, I think humans also have a tendency to travel in packs and surrender individual judgment to the will of a group and allow the loudest voices to hijack that group, the lowest common denominator to hijack that group. That side of us is only reinforced today by the technology that's around us, by the world of reflexive likes and retweets. Human nature and our respect for it and fear of it is the reason all FBI agents in training and all FBI intelligence analysts in training go to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, so they can see and hear and feel what we are capable of. What people who are believing they are righteous and lack constraint and oversight can do. When people surrender their moral authority to the group. It's also the reason that every new analyst and agent at the FBI is required to take a course on this organization's interactions with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It's intended to remind all of them of the dangers of becoming untethered to oversight and accountability without having checks on human nature. And as a further reminder about human nature, I think all of my employees now know this. I have an old desk that has a glass tabletop. In the right-hand corner of it, under the glass, is a single piece of paper. It's from October of 1963. And it's a memo from J. Edgar Hoover to Robert F. Kennedy, the Attorney General of the United States, asking for permission to bug Martin Luther King Jr. It's 5 sentences long. It's utterly devoid of factual content of any consequence. There's no date limitation, there's no geographic limitation. It simply says, we need to bug this guy, essentially. Hoover signed it, Kennedy signed it, and they're off to the races. This isn't about me trying to pick on Bobby Kennedy or J. Edgar Hoover. But here's the thing. I have no doubt that they believed they were doing the right thing. I keep it there to remind me, in that spot, because that's the spot where every morning I review the thick stack of applications that the FBI is going to send to federal judges to ask permission to wiretap or bug people in our national security investigations. And those things are thicker than my arm. It's a huge pain in the neck. To get those orders, that's a great thing. And it sits there, that order, to remind me and everybody who hears about it to be very, very careful about being certain that your cause is just and your facts are right. I am hugely grateful to Kenyon for a bunch of reasons. You have afforded my son an incredible education. I'm grateful to all of you for fighting to find the space to have a quality conversation about privacy and to talk about things that matter. My hope is that tonight, when we start talking, and over the next 2 days, you will engage, you will question assumptions and biases, your own and those of the people you're talking with. You'll ask good questions, you'll listen with an open mind, and by that I mean a mind open to being convinced, even if you are not convinced at the end of the day. I also hope we will resist the temptation to demonize anybody in this discussion, whether that's the tech companies or the government or anybody else. I haven't seen any demons in this conversation. We are all people trying to do the right thing as we see the right. It is not for the FBI to decide how this country should govern itself. It's not for the FBI to decide what the right approach is here. Our job is to investigate. Our job is to tell you, the people who pay for us, when the tools you count on us to use aren't working so much anymore, so you can figure out what to do about that. It's also not the job of the technology companies to tell you what to do about this. Their job is to innovate and come up with the next great thing, and they're spectacular at that, which is to be treasured. How we move forward needs to be resolved by the American people, and especially the young, who know technology so well and who care so deeply about getting the hard things right. So thank you for caring about it. Thank you for getting involved. I look forward to our conversation. Thank you very much. Giraffe, so I'm going to pull a stool over so I'm not 19 feet tall, and we can have a conversation. You can ask me anything. I'm from Washington. I'm slippery.
We've got two mics on each side. If folks just want to take it, line up and pose some questions to the director.
That was a great speech. Thanks for coming. The one thing you said that, and I agree with what you were saying, I think we need to have this conversation. But I think the central thing that everybody has got in the back of their head is when you can unencrypt or decrypt something, you said something like you're confident that it would be protected. Please address that.
Yeah, I can address it with a certain, I'll try and address it. I have to be a little bit vague. The FBI is very good at keeping secrets. And the people we bought this from, I know a fair amount about them, and I have a high degree of confidence that they are very good at protecting it, and their motivations align with ours. That doesn't mean we're having discussions within the government about, okay, so should we tell Apple what the flaw is that was found? That's an interesting conversation, because we tell Apple they're going to fix it, and then we're back where we started from. But look, we have actually, as silly as that may sound, we may end up there. We just haven't decided yet. And we also have to figure out, so what do we do? This work to open this one 5C, the reason I keep saying 5C iOS 9, everybody here knows this, it's a bit of a technological corner case, because the world has moved on to 6s. This doesn't work in 6s, doesn't work in a 5S. And so we have a tool that works on a narrow slice of phones. I'm talking to college kids, you probably all have 4s, right? I feel sorry for you. But that's why I say that. That's why I say that. I can never be completely confident, but I'm pretty confident about that. I guess we should switch sides? I think we should. Sir.
A question with respect to Aaron Burr, sir. The FBI briefs in the Apple litigation reference a precedent going way back to the 18th century involving the use of encryption by Aaron Burr, who, like other founding fathers, used a given technology at the time entirely unbreakable Vignere cipher. And I wonder whether the history of encryption running back that far doesn't suggest, one, that the balance you're saying is now been disrupted included, even at the founding, the understanding that it would sometimes be possible to encode documents in a way that no one could break. And second, whether if then is now an individual with the right math, without the help of a large corporation, could encrypt things in a way that no mandate to an external company would affect, isn't the Bureau basically stuck finding other ways to access that information when people don't rely on Google, but roll their own encryption, use open source software, not subject to legislative mandates?
Yeah, good question, thank you. I don't know the history well enough, but I agree with the premise in the question that I hope I said this, I meant to. Encryption has always been a feature of our lives. It's always been available to sophisticated actor. So Berg can be considered a sophisticated actor. And so what I think is the step change for us is the default nature of it. We've grappled with it in spy cases and lots of other cases, encryption. But we've never seen a world where all of the people's papers and effects were covered by strong encryption. And maybe that's a confluence both of the technology and the centrality of mobile devices to our lives. Maybe it's those two things that have made it different. And people can argue with me, maybe I'm not thinking about it right, but I think that's a step change. And so I don't think the history makes me think about it differently in that respect. Second part of your question?
Aren't you just silent individuals?
Oh yeah. That is, aren't you going to be stuck in any event? Yeah, to a certain extent. And so that makes me think of two things. First, that's a bit of the corner case situation. We'll always have sophisticated actors, but we will have to figure out other ways to investigate. And one of the consequences that we have to talk about in this debate too is we're going to continue to try and do our job to protect people. And so if default encryption remains widely available, that may be where we end up for a bunch of reasons. To do our job, we got to do a whole lot better with informants, with sources of all kinds, with undercover. We've got to be much more aggressive and find other ways to conduct surveillance. And that raises other interesting questions about what the American people want us to be doing. But I think we'll confront it no matter how. Let's imagine that somehow Magic Law went away and Apple said, geez, you were right, I hadn't thought about it, and so we're not going to encrypt anymore, and Google changed it, and WhatsApp says, oh, you're right, we'll reverse it. We're still going to deal with encryption in a lot of different ways in our lives, but maybe not in the default way that I think changes the analysis so broadly. Okay.
Director, I just wonder if you could expound on something I think you alluded to earlier in your speech. Many of the tech companies that you talked about make hundreds of billions of dollars, and as you pointed out, they use a lot of that money for the next new thing, the next best thing, including encryption. It seems to me they spend a lot less money in monitoring the activities of some of the nefarious users of their cloud. So my question to you is, what level of either criminal or civil culpability do you think that these companies have when their products are used in support of criminal activity or terrorist activity?
That's an interesting question. I'm not expert enough to answer the civil part of it. There's been some interesting discussion about whether there might be liability exposure in certain contexts. There's a senator, White House from Rhode Island, who asked about that. And so that's interesting. I don't have a view on it. With respect to criminal exposure, very unlikely unless you're in a situation where they know and intend that their device or their system be used in furtherance of the criminal activity. There's interesting arguments to be made about that. I actually don't think it's a big area of focus, should be a big area of focus for the Bureau. What we're trying to do instead is make sure that they understand the threat and that we're not exaggerating, we're not kidding, so we spend a lot of time trying to have them understand the ISIL threat in particular. ISIL threat that killed Twitter's CEO, which helped the conversation a bit, focus them. But they see the darkness better than before and are working very hard, consistent with their rules of service, to police themselves. I think we've seen a big change in Twitter in that regard in the last 2 years. So that's how I think about it.
Nathan Grosh, thank you so much for your speech. I really enjoyed it. That was very thrilling and interesting. I was wondering if you could address another point that you made about kind of the history that we've talked about. And it's my opinion that we've never had access to this much information. This much information has never in the history of the government been available for access. And how do you feel is like a talking point for security? This means that maybe there are certain things that are private, that must be private, must be kept private, and simply because they haven't been available for decryption or discovery by the government, that becomes important now.
Yeah. That's a very important topic because a lot of thoughtful people have said to me, hey, wait a minute, you live in the golden age of surveillance. Right? We have never left so much digital dust in everything that we do. And my reaction to that is, okay, I get that, but here's my problem. I think we live in a golden age of communication. It's absolutely true there's metadata available in an ISIL investigation that there wasn't 10 years ago. But 10 years ago, Al-Qaeda could not communicate and reach into the United States. They couldn't even imagine the way that ISIL could do it today because of the ubiquity of social media networks and all of that that's so wonderful. So I turn it around on people and say, yeah, it's golden age of surveillance, maybe, but it's actually the golden age of communication. So that's how I think about that. Related is a really interesting question, which I didn't raise in my speech because I didn't want to seem defensive. But we all make a whole lot of information available to private companies, far more than the government could ever collect, process, or even ask a court to get. And that's an interesting dynamic in this discussion. Some people suggested to me, you know what you ought to do to deal with this is you ought to start getting court process to get data from the data aggregators who are picking up all of their digital dust. And, you know, that strikes me, I hate the term backdoor, we can talk about that. That strikes me as kind of a weird backdoor to this conversation. I'd rather have it up front, and then if we run out of ways to do our job or really impaired, then we'll think about that. But I'm loath to go down that path, honestly, without confronting this challenge head on.
Hi, thank you for coming to speak to us. My question is about the role of the FBI in the United States compared to other organizations in other countries that do similar work. I would argue that the FBI has been more effective in its job of preventing terrorist attacks than France and other European countries. Do you think that surveillance has a role to play in the U.S.'s ability to prevent significant attacks in this day and age?
It does. It's very important, which is one of the reasons I'm sounding the alarm on this. But I'll tell you something. A number of the countries that you mentioned have far more, I don't know whether the term is liberal or aggressive, surveillance regimes than we do. Because the way it works here is the FBI goes to a judge, makes showing of probable cause, gets the ability to intercept for a limited period of time, carefully overseen. Rules in a place like France, they're able to conduct surveillance, electronic surveillance easier. So I'm not sure that's the key difference. I honestly think it's the pain and the investment since September 11th. We lost 3,000 people, a pain that's hard to even get your head around, and we responded to that. Right? We invested billions and billions of our dollars to change the FBI, change the CIA, change the NSA, change the Border Patrol, and that investment made a big, big difference. We are today the way you thought we were before 9/11. You invested money so we see dots. We're not perfect, we're far from perfect, but we are well ahead of a lot of our European counterparts because of the investment the American people have made in breaking down silos, in connecting systems, in changing the law in a thoughtful way. And they're going through that pain while they're under attack right now. And think about it this way. Lots of different countries, different cultures, and different languages, all part of the EU, but it's a huge task to bring that together, to share information from Belgium to France to Germany in an effective way. So I don't think the key is surveillance, actually. I think it's sort of the way you use your tools and the way in which you've organized and deployed and given resources to your counterterrorism forces.
Hi, Director Comey. Thanks for making a special trip here today. My wife and I also made a special trip. It took us 2.5 hours to get here. So, a little bit of background on the question. My wife and I are among the 20 million Americans whose total personal information profile was stolen by hackers during the attacks against the Office of Personnel Management. And this was...
Me too.
Okay, I thought as much. The OPM had known for years they were vulnerable to attack, but they didn't fix the problems that were there. And then after the attacks, no one at the OPM, as far as I know, was criminally charged for their negligence, and yet their lack of action left 20 million people vulnerable to identity theft and exploitation. So this was a real soul-searching event for myself, and I found that my faith in our government was damaged a bit. And I was wondering about another situation I hope you could speak to where sensitive information wasn't handled the way maybe it should have been, and whether appropriate people will be held accountable. So you said I could ask you a question.
Okay, go ahead. You want me to respond on the OPM thing?
Sure.
No, go ahead, finish.
Okay. Well, as everyone knows here, Hillary Clinton exclusively used a secret email account.
That's one I'm definitely not talking about. I was interviewed by the Collegian today. They took a shot. It didn't work.
Well, some
that's a violation of the Espionage Act. And so I guess I'm just wondering, do you think that she'll be held accountable for misdeeds and receive equal treatment under the law, or is she more likely to get a free pass and because of who she is and the type of office she's running for?
So let me tell you all about that investigation. I'm not going to comment. And I hope all of you know why. I love the FBI because we aspire to, and I think we are, three things. We're honest, we're competent, or independent. We're not perfect, we're competent, we're independent. And I've stayed close to that investigation to ensure that it's done that way. That we have the resources, the technology, the people, and that there's no outside influence. And so if I talk about an investigation while it's going on, there's a risk that I'll compromise both the reality and the perception that it's done honestly, competently, and independently. So I'm going to say no comment to that. With the OPM breach, the pain you feel is real, and I feel it. The only good news that I can offer you in that situation is I really don't perceive a risk to any of us from a financial perspective from that theft. And it got a little confusing because the government bought credit insurance for all of us, which is like buying flood insurance when your house burns down. The problem is not the flood. There's a significant counterintelligence risk with someone having that, a nation state having that. So I'm not making you feel any better, but I don't think, but this is true, I don't think Aunt Sally needs to worry about her credit cards being run up by the people who stole it. What I have to worry about is that Aunt Sally will send me an email with, Cousin Joe's picnic pictures, and I'll click on it because I actually think it's Aunt Sally and Cousin Joe, and it's not. And all of a sudden someone's in my electronic house that shouldn't be there. That's a big, big worry. So that's where we are there.
Hello. I was wondering, so you mentioned this a little bit in your speech about the woman in Baton Rouge, and I was just wondering how many phones, is this going to be, the FBI has this technology and you stress that you believe you can keep it secure. How willing are you to assist in other investigations, maybe on the state level?
Yeah, we're trying to sort that out now. We routinely try to help state and local police with devices. If they have a search, all different kinds of devices. If they have a search warrant, we try and help them figure out how they can get it open and recover data. And so we're going to try to lean as far forward as possible to help them. We have to navigate a number of things, including its utility in national security cases. And so if we decide not to disclose it to Apple, it's still quite perishable. And it will disappear if Apple changes its software in some way. It will also disappear if we use it in a criminal case and it has to be disclosed. Our discovery rules are important. Has to be disclosed, then it becomes public, and then it disappears. So we have to weigh those things and trying to figure that out. So we're having a whole lot of conversations inside the government, lots of different parts of the government, to figure out, so how do we think about disclosing to Apple? How do we think about who we can help with this, and what would be the rules under which we would help them? I could imagine a world maybe where local police department, in a case they can't otherwise solve, can send us a device with the understanding that we're never going to testify, we're never going to tell you how we opened it, so you're never going to be able to use what's on the phone as evidence. But it might be a lead to something that would be useful. But those are the conversations we're having literally right now. I had one of them this morning. So we'll sort that out in the near future, I hope.
Hi. You brought up the examples. You mentioned that FBI trainees go to the Holocaust Memorial, as well as the example of bugging MLK or request to bug MLK. Maybe you think of XO 1966, and I was thinking of in 1988, the U.S. government finally formally apologized for the internment of Japanese Americans. And although it's not quite iPhones, the government surrounds that situation.
Say it again, I lost that last phrase.
Although it's not quite iPhones, I think the rhetoric that surrounded the internment of Japanese Americans is a lot of what we're hearing today as far as security and privacy goes. I was wondering if the FBI foresees a future in which we're going to have to issue apologies for violating human rights and even national security.
In what connection?
In the connection that I think security is a human right and is a right in itself, and the kind of things that we're talking about in the name of national security is violating those rights. Encrypting phones, accessing information. Do you foresee a future in which we're going to have these kinds of same apologies issued, or is it always going to be justified?
That's hard to answer at the abstract level you asked it. there should always be apologies when there are mistakes made. And I'm a big apologizer because I make a lot of mistakes. But I don't see in this context yet a basis where I can imagine a future where the government has to apologize, which is why we're talking about it. I mean, it's nothing like transparency and sunshine to avoid having to have conversations that involve apologies down the road. So I don't in this context. I don't.
Thank you for being here. You mentioned at the very beginning of the speech about an expectation of privacy with banking, and I sort of thought of the Panama Papers. And I was wondering, as the director, I can only assume that you've been briefed on, I guess, whatever, or whomever they sort of incriminate. And I know we've already seen issues abroad where, like, Iceland, Prime Minister stepping down. And I'm wondering, I guess, do you foresee any backlash in America from those papers, or I guess, and in terms of encryption and privacy, maybe what we can learn from that?
Too early to say, so I can't really comment on that. And I don't know whether encryption played a role. Maybe they weren't well encrypted, which is why the journalists are having these conversations about them. So I don't know is the honest answer. And I can't comment. I'm obviously very aware of the matter, but I can't comment on it yet.
Hi, I found it interesting that you brought up the phenomena of how much trouble people have having sort of a logical discourse about the subject. And I was thinking, and it sort of occurred to me that that might be the case because due to the recent influx of technological advances, including encryption, and due to the amount of time that legislation takes to draft and pass, there's not a lot of specific legislation dealing with what to do in instances where we might need to decrypt a phone, etc. And I was wondering if you thought that maybe if some more specific legislation were introduced, if that would maybe be helpful to opening the discourse to a more logical level, and also was curious in your personal opinions on where you would delineate where it should be allowed to invade privacy as opposed to not.
Yeah, two good questions. The first one, I don't know is the honest answer. There are some very thoughtful people on Capitol Hill one group has issued legislation calling for a national commission, and the executive branch is trying to figure out a position on that. And then there's discussion in the Senate Intelligence Committee of Senator Feinstein and Senator Burr introducing legislation that, as I understand it, would require companies to be able to comply with court orders. And so I don't know enough about whether there could be productive conversation on Capitol Hill about those in an election year. Maybe. But we have to have the conversation at some point. That branch of government has to be involved. And so I'm sure they will be. I have to testify tomorrow in front of a committee touching on these issues. And so maybe, I guess, is my answer. What can I imagine? I don't know for sure. And one of the reasons I say the FBI shouldn't tell you what the answer is, the FBI really knows what the answer should be. A number of thoughtful people have said to me, this has to have international implications. You're dead right. One thing we don't want to do is come up with a solution that chases American innovation or customers to other countries. And I know that all countries that care about the rule of law care about this issue. And so I can imagine a world where there's an international norm framework of some sort that says these nations agree that if certain due process hurdles are met, then and only then can government get access to otherwise encrypted communications. That's international. In the United States, I can imagine a world where the law simply requires that if a judge issues an order, a maker of devices in the United States or a provider of communication services of any kind in the United States must be able to comply. And figure out how to comply. The government shouldn't tell you how to comply, figure out how to comply. And the reason I imagine that world is that's a big part of our world today. There's a lot of companies today that I think have secure devices. Certainly Apple did until the end of 2014, and comply with court orders. They're major providers of internet services that encrypt in motion and decrypt on their servers so they can sell you ads. They want to read your emails, and then they re-encrypt. Well, they comply with court orders. Apple today encrypts the iCloud, and then they're able to decrypt it. I don't know how, but they decrypt it, and then they're able to comply with court orders. And so it's being done today, which is what leads me to say, I'm not sure it's a technological problem so much as a business model problem. That doesn't make it an easier question, but that's the world I could imagine. All kinds of challenges to getting to that world. And that's why I think the FBI, I just answered unfortunately, but should not be saying, here's what we're going to do. We're investigators. We ought to just tell you, hey, we got a big problem, people. Here's how it's affecting our work. You figured out a Kenyon.
So at the end of your speech, you talked about the communication between Kennedy and Peter. You said it was like an example of what not to do. So could you comment on like the incredibly lax policy and like biased rulings of the FISA court, who's only denied like 12 requests in the last almost 40 years to gather information?
Yeah, I can do them. I'm going to take on the predicate of your question. I never, in my career as a federal prosecutor, had a request for a wiretap turned down by a federal judge. And I think the reason for that is we were terrified of losing one. And we had to go to the Department of Justice to get permission. We had to get sign-off all the way up to the leadership. We had to get the U.S. Attorney's sign-off. And if it got rejected, we felt like we were screwed. And so we would always pull back and not go in. So the fact that the FISA court has not turned down a FISA thing, on the surface might leave you with that impression, but when you look inside, I'm not sure it leads to the same inference. And the other thing that goes on in the FISA court, as with federal courts, is the government will share a draft of an application. And the court will look at it and say, you're going to have to, I need more information, and the government will make changes and send it back. So there's an iteration process that goes on underneath it. So I don't accept the premise of your question, so I guess I stopped there.
It just seems like on the face level, like when you have over 35,000 requests for data and you're only denying 12, maybe you're not looking at the information in it, but you're looking at the person and maybe like basing it off like them on service level and not what they're doing or what they're looking at.
Sure.
Within them.
And I'm saying I can see why you draw that inference from the outside, but I think if you stare at it a little more closely, that you can see competing inferences. In fact, one I think is more reasonable. But I understand why you see that inference.
Hi. So we talked about San Bernardino a lot, and we talked about the iPhone 5C iOS 9 quite a bit, and that was encrypted. But one of the things that was not encrypted during the San Bernardino attack was the police scanners, the local police scanners. And not only were those publicly available, those were being live streamed online. And as a law enforcement official, I can imagine why that would freak you out. So I guess my question is to flip the conversation on its head. It's the default setting on a lot of local police departments is to leave these police scanners unencrypted. Even though the technology exists to do it, it's just kind of expensive. Do you think that we should be willing to make the investment to encrypt those local police scanners? I know at the federal level they are, but at the local level they're not. And if so, why? As I guess we're sort of flipping on its head. Why is encryption problematic for private citizens? And if you think we should encrypt for the police departments, why is it okay for them?
I think it's just a question of money. We had 18,000 police departments in the United States. Nearly all of them have fewer than 200 officers, and so they don't have the dough. And as you said, our radios are encrypted. It's good tradecraft to have them encrypted, so the bad guys just don't sit on the scanner and know you're coming. But departments are doing it. It's just, especially in the last 8 years, they just haven't had the money. And so I really think that's it. That's the issue.
Hello, Director. I just want to preface this by saying I have a great deal of respect for the FBI. I watch the X-Files a lot too, so that helps.
That's all true.
I did want to go back a little bit to San Bernardino and how the FBI used a third party, as you said, to help unencrypt the phone. And I guess I was just wondering, I know you said that this wasn't supposed to set any kind of a precedent and you were wary of slippery slope arguments, but I'm sure that the Bureau has plenty of devices that they do want to unlock either now or in the future. And I was just wondering, is going to third party something that you guys usually do and will continue to do? And like, what kind of security risks and implications could come of that? Is that really a secure way to do it?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have lots and lots of devices that we can't open. So does state and local law enforcement. The DA in Manhattan says he has 200 now iPhones that he can't unlock. And a number of people said I was an idiot in connection with the San Bernardino case, and maybe an idiot for other reasons, but I don't think this one. What I meant by, it's not intended to send a message. People said, but won't it set a precedent? Of course, in the sense that every case is a precedent in some circumstances. The That's not the reason we brought the litigation. But anybody who thinks that I just figured out at the San Bernardino case that this is a problem has not been listening to me for 2 years. This affects huge swaths of our work. So yes, it's a big feature. The answer is we use contractors in a lot of different ways, especially when it comes to high-tech stuff. Because this won't shock you. There's no monopoly on innovation in the government as a whole, but especially when it comes to technology. So if we can find some smart young kids who don't want to work for the government, but they've set up a company in their basement, and we can contract with them for them to help us solve a particular problem, sure, that makes sense for us. Now, if I can trick them into coming to work for us, even better. And I have a whole pitch there, which I'll spare you. But, so yeah, we use contractors a lot, especially at the edges of technology. People who may have seen things or thought of things or encountered things that we haven't. We have to have that kind of humility. Otherwise, we'd have this attitude that if it didn't happen, if not made here, we would use it, we'd be less effective that way.
It seems as though, especially in the 21st century, technology innovation is just advancing and never increasing a bit. And it strikes me as one of the major problems with that is how legislation affects that. It feels like legislation is requiring kind of this technological innovation. So I was wondering if you have any comments on that, or how the FBI works in the legal system to address that.
I think there's no doubt that legislation has not kept pace with technology, and you see lots of examples of that. Congress passed a statute 20 years ago, almost 30 years ago, to require the telcos, telephone companies, traditional copper wires, to be able to comply with court orders. Then there had to be, in addition to that, when all of a sudden voice over internet protocol was an important thing. And there's a good argument to be made that what's happening here is the legal framework is not keeping pace with the way in which we all communicate. So what the Bureau can do about that is what we're doing now, which is try and tell people, try and tell Congress, brief them on the threats we're seeing and the way in which technology is moving. And so legislation is a slow, painful process, which I think is the way it should be. That's my warning about we want to do this now and not have an emergency, because the only time it moves fast is when there is a terrible, terrible thing happens. So we have to go through that slow, painful process now.
I was just in the room, so pardon me if this has already been asked, but I'm in a civil disobedience class here at Kenyon, and we were discussing today how specifically with unlocking the Apple phone, part of their reason not to was the protection of civil disobedience actors in governments and not letting the government utilize this tool in a way that stops advancement in a legal way. So my question here is twofold. Firstly, even if our government uses this information correctly and does not usurp it in a way that would infringe on civil disobedience actors, what is to stop it from other governments doing this? And secondly, do you think there's a different expectation of privacy when it comes to civil disobedience actors? If there were, I mean, specifically with the bug order for MLK, is there a different amount of privacy if you are one of those people? Is that? So that's my...
That's good. I'll take the second part first, because that's easier, because I don't know. I've not thought about that. My initial instinct is everybody in the United States ought to have the same protections against government power, no matter what your motivation is in communicating or walking around. With respect to the first part, you put your finger, I think I mentioned this, one of the great things about encryption, and one of the things that complicates this whole issue, is it enables people in repressive regimes to communicate without being cracked down upon. So here's how I think about that, which is why I said international has to be a key part of this. My first reaction is, ought we not to figure out how we want to govern ourselves in the United States, and then think about that? But reasonable people have said, no, it's so important you ought to think about that as part of the first conversation. So I'm not highly confident my approach is right. But I do believe that an international compact among the rule of law nations would actually be protective. Because a lot of people have said, well, if we do this for you, we got to do it for the Chinese. And my response is, well, if the Chinese would sign up to do what I'm talking about doing, which is going to a neutral and detached judge and showing a probable cause, getting a written order for a 90-day period to intercept communications, that would be great for the Chinese people. think the Chinese government is going to sign up for that. So I can imagine a world where the community of nations that care about the rule of law actually set this up as a bit of a protective bubble. I don't know, but that's one of the things that makes this so hard. We don't want to chase innovation away. We don't want to expose human rights, people who are reporting human rights abuses in different parts of the world. And one of the reasons the government helped fund the Onion Router, the Tor network, which now features so many pedophilia, drug trafficking, arms trafficking investigations, was to have a vehicle for people to be able to communicate in repressive regimes, and for some of our own government sources and actors to be able to communicate. So that's one of the things that I think makes it very complicated. Now that's been my approach, that ought we not to figure out how we should be, and then talk about what the international implications are? Yeah, it's a very, very good question.
Thank you.
Yeah. Could they hear anything in the overflow room?
Yeah.
Because it was terrible. Sir, sorry.
I would like to know if you could write the law that gave your bureau access to these large companies' encryptions, what that law would look like. And if it's a backdoor, and in response, Americans move their encryption needs to overseas third-party tech companies, what does the next law look like?
Yeah, great question.
Thank you for doing Q&A.
Oh, sure. The second part of that connects to what and the last question I was just talking about, that there's a very strong argument that the answer to this has to have some international component. Else you risk, that's what I meant by chasing innovation and chasing customers outside the United States. That's the second part. With respect to the first part, if I could write it, it would be something along the lines I just talked about, which is CALIA-like, that if you provide communication services in the United States or you market devices in the United States, you must be able to comply with lawful court orders and let 1,000 flowers bloom. I know I hear the term backdoor all the time. I'm not exactly sure what it means. Whatever it means, I don't want it. I want people to be able to comply with court orders. And as I said, today, banks do, healthcare providers do, telephone companies do, voice over internet protocol, Apple does for the iCloud. I imagine a world where they figure it out and produce to us clear text. That's probably the best world from the investigator's perspective. Now, whether that's the best world for America is not for me to decide, but if it was only my considerations, that would have looked like. That's what it would look like. But the international piece, it has to be part of it. And I know the French wanted to be part of it, the UK, the Belgians, the Germans, all of them are seeing this same problem with public safety. And so they're constantly coming to us saying, so what are we going to do? You're the leader. What should we do? The Australians, the New Zealanders, all want to figure out how to address this in the context of the rule of law. So we thought it was hard just with Congress. I'm sorry, I have to put it right here.
Director Comey, thank you for coming. I do want to preface by saying I lived with Brian in this freshman year. You always expect to meet like your hallmates' parents, and I never expected that this would be how I meet Brian's dad. My question is related to the Economics of Crime seminar that I'm currently in, and obviously from an economic perspective, economists try and weigh the costs and benefits of policies and things that are enacted in laws. And so obviously, benefits of unencrypting or having Apple unencrypt this data is that it might further the investigation, help find these terrorists, and help eventually defeat ISIL or ISIS. And then, of course, there's the whole idea of the precedent that it sets, and then competing, like other countries competing to try and help you find it, and the establishment of, like you said, backdoors that have been created to help you get into the phone, and the question of whether those backdoors have been sold to other countries and a market for them arises. So I'm wondering how you weigh the costs and benefits of, getting into a phone like this and unencrypting the data, because it seems to me that there are a lot of benefits to encryption, and you sort of were a little bit ambiguous about exactly what those benefits are. So I guess I'd like to hear a little bit more about, each side.
Okay. Benefits of encryption. I think I hit this, but I hit it again. The gentleman who asked about OPM, if my security clearance paperwork and his had been strongly encrypted, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Banks, hospital data, health insurance data, the FBI would have far less to do on our cyber investigation and protecting people's privacy if there was more readily available encryption, more people used it. And there's lots of, we talked about human rights, protecting dissenters in oppressive regimes, protecting sources of the FBI's that may be operating in a hostile place, a hostile country. All the reasons you might want to be able to hide your communications. There's tons. We'd probably go on all day. So I see tons of benefits. I see tons of benefits on the other side, or I guess you could frame them as costs on the other side. So I don't know precisely how to weigh them. And not to cop out on it, but I don't think that's my job to weigh it. I think my job is to say, awful people, here's cost. And that cost is being shifted to victims, to law enforcement, and we all need to think about whether that makes sense, given the cost that we impose by changing the way we operate in the United States for technology. So I'm glad you're taking the course. I wish it wasn't just about crime, because it's more than crime, but that's how thoughtful people need to think about it. And that's why it's a messy, difficult conversation. We'll probably inevitably have to be in Congress, which is in the business of trying to weigh competing costs and benefits and trade-offs. And then we'll get to a place that makes sense, and then we'll have to change it again in 5 years or 10 years. So I wish I could give you a clear answer to that, but I don't think it's susceptible to clear, econometric answer. Brian's okay. He really is.
In one of my classes, we just... Yeah, sure. How's this?
Good.
In one of my classes, we just finished a conversation about Foucault's discussion of Gnosticism. And I was wondering what effect do you think the current raised awareness of surveillance will have on individuals' actions within this country? And will this assist or detract from the goals of your organization?
And the awareness of surveillance, you mean raised by me talking about it, or raised by all sources?
Media and just access to media and stuff like that with everything that's going on with Sandra and the iPhones, how people are more aware. And I don't know, all sorts of stuff with like your TV watching you. Apple watches listening to your breakfast references. I don't know, like all that kind of stuff. I feel like people are more aware that others could be listening. What effect do you think that will have?
I think that's quite good on balance, because I think it will, because I hope what it will do is channel maybe some anxiety around that, but that anxiety will be channeled into an engagement, that everybody will understand this is our decision to make, your decision, my decision as a citizen to make. The inflection point was Snowden, really. And we saw, sometimes people say to me, how can you start talking about it, now you're going to let the bad guys know? Long before I became FBI director, 3 months, the bad guys got a very clear look. And terrorist tradecraft changed, lots of tradecraft changed. Apple didn't make its change, though, until the end of 2014. And it surprised me, it surprised all of us. I remember how I first commented on this. It was in the paper one morning, and I happened to be having a regular pencil and pen meeting with the press that covers us. And someone said, I wasn't even planning to talk about this, and someone says, what do you think about the fact that all Apple phones are going to be encrypted now? And I imprudently to sort of wing something. But the conversation about surveillance was not driven by Apple's change, or my reaction to Apple's change, or litigation. It began in the summer of 2013. And you can debate whether, from overall perspective, it was good or bad. I think it was bad, but others have a different view. But I think that's when that conversation began. And I think we have an opportunity to channel it into something healthy. I don't think it should freak you out. I think you should demand the details. Demand to know how the government conducts surveillance, how they're overseen, how they're constrained. Demand to know how these devices work. Demand to know whether it is true. I saw someone doing this, so I copied it. I put a piece of tape. I have obviously a laptop, personal laptop, put a piece of tape over the camera. So I saw somebody smarter than I had a piece of tape over their camera. And so I think you should channel it into a healthy awareness, a demand for information, and engagement. Especially young people. You really should. It's Foucault, is that what you said?
All right, we'll make this the last quick question, and then we're going to wrap it up.
Very intense. Yeah, anyone This is actually a little bit off topic.
Is it about Hillary Clinton?
Yes. I was actually kind of asking about the Ferguson effect and kind of your opinion on that. The Ferguson effect, this idea that there's been an increase in crime across the country because of protests against police brutality against minorities. What do you think of this theory? And how do you think we should balance legitimate anger and skepticism of the police in the way they handle these issues and kind of letting the police do their legitimate job?
Yeah, I'll try and be brief. That's off topic, but that's a really important topic. What I started struggling with mid-year last year to the end of last year especially, and I'm still struggling with it, is something is happening. A whole lot more people of color are being murdered in America's largest cities in shocking ways. The top 50 cities last year, 38 of them experienced a dramatic spike in violence. And the deaths were almost all in communities of color. And so I saw that map and I said, whoa. And what's confusing about the map is, it's all over the country. And yet there are cities near other cities where they're not seeing the spike. And there's cities that have nothing in common crime-wise. Right? North and east cities have no problem with heroin. West is methamphetamine. Different gangs. But all of a sudden you see Sacramento, and you see Louisville, and you see Orlando, and you see Austin, and Dallas, but not Houston. And so I saw that, and I saw it was all happening since the beginning of 2015. And so the question I've asked myself is, what explains that map and that calendar? And lots of police chiefs said, well, it must be heroin. Okay, but here, not here. And so I don't know what the answer is. What I heard from a lot of cops when I traveled around the country was, something has changed in the way we do our work. And I don't like the term Ferguson effect, because I actually don't think it's because of protests. I don't think it's because of Ferguson. I think it may be, and I don't know the answer to this, but I think it may be some impact from viral videos. That somehow police are fearing being that video, and in some places it's causing a marginal pullback. The officers may not even notice. Instead of getting out of their car at midnight and saying to 5 guys on a street corner, what are you guys doing here? You live around here? They're not doing that. They're responding to 911 calls, doing their job, but not really doing their job. And I've heard that all over the country. And so I don't know for sure, but I gave a speech about this last year, and all kinds of people threw rocks at me as a result of it. But people have died. And they're people of a color that most of America could just drive around in and say, it's those people. We have to talk about this. Something is going on. And maybe it's a confluence of heroin and methamphetamine and gang problems all coming here at the same time. Maybe. Or maybe there's something, the marginal accumulation of thousands of decisions is changing some cities in the way they police. I really don't know. But I have a 10-year term, so I'm going to talk about it. Because I care a lot about people's lives. And so, I don't know. I'll give you one, a lot of smart people here. I'll give you one metaphor I'm using that I'm really not using with the press, but I'm about to say it publicly. When you think about Major League Baseball, and this is not a frivolous comparison, if there were incidents in Major League Baseball, 2 or 3 times, pitchers hit batters in the face, and it happened in quick succession, and those videos played over and over and over and over again, all day long. And then Major League Baseball, the umpires announced, we're cracking down on inside pitching. Now, throwing at a batter is just wrong in any circumstance. But pitching to the inside of the plate is an important part of baseball. My common sense tells me what would happen to pitching is pitchers would move the ball, on average, in a little bit. And the consequence would be more hits and runs. And over time, it would drift back. And then baseball would return the way it was, and there'd be this statistical anomaly in that summer, and you couldn't quite understand it. But what we're talking about here is not hits and runs. And if that's what's going on, the marginal accumulation of lots of small decisions is changing the way neighborhoods are policed, we have to talk about that. And so I've been talking to police chiefs saying, you need to insist that your people police in an appropriate way, transparent, respectful, and up close. And communities, especially communities of color, need to say, we deserve that kind of policing. We want our officers respectful, transparent, and out of their cars, and talking to people. That's how neighborhoods stay safe, with great policing. And so The term Ferguson effect has gotten great currency in the media, as has backdoors. They're confusing terms. I really think they take us off topic. The question is there something about the viral nature of the coverage of actual misconduct, which is very serious, that is changing police activity? Here's the problem. That just took me 4 minutes to explain, 5 minutes. The media's like, we don't know what he's talking about. It's a conflict narrative. And, where's the White House on this? But it requires really serious people who care to step back and say, so what's going on? And do it honestly. And so I'm going to keep talking about it. I'm going to give another speech. We just got our quarterly data, and it's even worse in a lot of places. And the country's not talking about it. So I'm going to talk about it some more and see what happens. So thank you all for your time.